The rain hammered against the kitchen window like angry fists, each drop a reminder of how everything in Sarah Chen's life seemed to be falling apart at once. She sat at the scarred wooden table that had seen better decades, staring at the eviction notice that might as well have been written in her own blood. 30 days. That's all she had left before she and her 8-year-old daughter Emma would be sleeping in their rusted Honda Civic, if the car even lasted that long. The numbers on the paper blurred as tears threatened to spill. 3 jobs: cleaning offices before dawn, stocking shelves during lunch breaks, and answering phones for a dental office until 9 at night, and still it wasn't enough. Never enough. The math was cruel and unforgiving. $1,847 in monthly expenses versus $1,203 in income. Each month she fell further behind, like trying to climb out of a hole while someone kept making it deeper. Emma's small voice cut through the sound of rain. "Mama, are we really going to have to move again?" Sarah quickly folded the notice and forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. "We're figuring it out, sweetheart. Don't you worry about grown-up stuff." But Emma wasn't fooled. At 8 years old, she'd already lived in 7 different apartments, each one smaller and shabbier than the last. She'd learned to pack her few belongings quickly, to not get too attached to neighbors or classmates, to pretend she didn't notice when her mother cried in the shower. The weight of premature wisdom sat heavy in her dark eyes. "Mrs. Patterson says her grandson is looking for someone to buy his farm. She says it's real cheap because nobody wants it." Sarah's laugh came out bitter. "Honey, we can't even afford this apartment. We definitely can't afford a farm." She said $350. The crayon Emma was holding, a worn stub of blue that had seen better days, slipped from her fingers and rolled across the table. Sarah caught it reflexively, her mind stuttering over the number. $350. That was less than what she owed in late fees on this apartment, less than their grocery budget for 2 months, less than the cost of the dental work she'd been putting off until her jaw ached constantly. That can't be right. "Mrs. Patterson don't lie," Emma said with the absolute certainty that only children possess about their favorite adults. "She says the farm's been empty for 2 years since Mr. Patterson's grandson moved to the city. Says it's got a little house and some land, but nobody wants to live way out there 'cause there ain't no jobs and the soil's no good for farming." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, their bed had been repossessed 3 months earlier. Sarah found herself standing outside Mrs. Patterson's door. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and broken dreams, the fluorescent light flickering like a dying heartbeat. She raised her hand to knock 3 times before finally finding the courage. Mrs. Patterson answered on the first knock, as if she'd been waiting. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair that caught the light like spun moonbeams and eyes that held decades of stories. "Sarah, honey, come in, come in. You look like you've seen a ghost." The apartment was exactly like Sarah's, but Mrs. Patterson had somehow transformed the cramped space into something that felt like home. Crochet doilies covered every surface, family photos smiled from mismatched frames, and the air smelled like cinnamon and safety. "Emma mentioned something about a farm," Sarah began, her voice catching slightly on the words. Mrs. Patterson's face softened with understanding. "My grandson Billy inherited it from my grandfather, my late husband, rest his soul. Property's been in our family for 47 years. But Billy's got no use for country living, wants to sell it quickly so he can put a down payment on some fancy condo downtown." She moved to an old wooden chest and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. 350 acres, about 2 hours northeast of here. House needs work, I won't lie to you. The roof leaks some, the plumbing's temperamental, and the heating system's older than the disco. But the bones are good, Sarah. The bones are really good. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The photographs were faded, but clear enough to make her breath catch. A small farmhouse with a wraparound porch sat nestled among fields that stretched toward a horizon painted in endless possibility. The house was white, or had been once, with green shutters and a brick chimney that promised warm fires on cold nights. Behind it, a red barn stood sentinel over fields that rolled like a rumpled quilt toward distant trees. "Why so cheap?" Sarah asked, though her heart was already racing with a hope she didn't dare acknowledge. Mrs. Patterson settled into her recliner with a soft grunt. "Land's not good for crops. Soil's too rocky, too many minerals. The previous owner tried for years to make it work, but couldn't grow much more than weeds and heartache. The county's been trying to sell it for taxes, but even at auction, nobody's interested in land that won't produce. Billy just wants it gone." Sarah studied the photographs more carefully. The house looked solid despite its need for cosmetic repairs. The barn could shelter animals or store belongings. The land stretched far enough that Emma could run and play without worrying about traffic or strangers. Most importantly, no landlord could demand rent money they didn't have. "I don't know anything about farming," Sarah admitted. "Honey, neither did half the people who ever tried it," Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "But you know about working hard, and you know about not giving up. That's more than most folks start with." The next morning, Sarah called in sick to all 3 jobs, the first time she'd missed work in over 2 years, and borrowed Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick for the drive to see the property. Emma bounced in the passenger seat like a pinball, her excitement infectious, despite Sarah's growing anxiety about spending money they couldn't afford on what might turn out to be a fool's dream. The drive took them through landscapes that gradually shifted from urban decay to suburban sprawl to rolling countryside dotted with farms and forests. Emma pressed her face to the window, marveling at cows and horses and barns that looked like they'd stepped out of storybooks. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in months, her shoulders unknotting as the city's weight fell away behind them. The GPS led them down increasingly narrow roads until they were bumping along a gravel driveway that hadn't seen maintenance in recent memory. Then the farmhouse came into view, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The photographs hadn't captured the way morning sunlight painted the weathered siding golden, or how the porch seemed to beckon with promises of lazy summer evenings. The barn stood proudly against a backdrop of hills that rolled away like ocean waves, and the silence was so complete it felt like peace made tangible. "Mama," Emma whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Billy Patterson turned out to be a nervous young man in an expensive suit who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. He fumbled with keys and apologized repeatedly for the property's condition as he showed them through rooms that smelled of dust and memories. The kitchen was small but functional, with windows that framed the rolling hills like living paintings. The living room had a stone fireplace that promised cozy winter nights, and the bedrooms were larger than anywhere they'd lived in years. "Plumbing works, mostly," Billy said, demonstrating a faucet that coughed before producing clear water. "Electrical's been updated, well, sort of, and the well water's good, even if it tastes a little funny sometimes." Sarah barely heard him. She was standing in what would be Emma's room, looking out at 350 acres of possibility. For the first time in years, she could envision a future that didn't involve eviction notices and sleepless nights counting money that would never be enough. The decision came with startling clarity. Standing in that dusty farmhouse with sunlight streaming through windows that needed cleaning, Sarah realized she wasn't just buying property, she was buying hope. She was buying a place where Emma could have a childhood instead of a series of temporary stops. She was buying the chance to build something instead of just surviving. "I'll take it," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. Billy looked relieved enough to kiss her. "Really? I mean, great. The paperwork's pretty straightforward, and we can close within a week if you can handle the cash transaction." $350. It represented every penny Sarah had managed to save over 6 months of skipped meals and walked miles to avoid bus fare. It was supposed to be emergency money, but this felt like the emergency she'd been saving for without knowing it. That night, lying on the couch in their soon-to-be former apartment, Emma curled up beside her like a kitten seeking warmth. Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the most foolish. The eviction notice still sat on the kitchen table, but somehow it no longer felt like a death sentence. Instead, it felt like a door closing so another one could open. "Mama?" Emma's sleepy voice drifted up from the darkness. "Are we really going to have our own farm?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, feeling something that might have been hope blooming in her chest like the first flower of spring. "Yeah, baby, we really are." Outside, the city hummed with its restless energy, but Sarah's dreams were filled with rolling hills and morning sunlight painting everything golden with possibility. Moving day arrived with the cruel indifference of a bill collector, gray clouds pressing down like a suffocating blanket over what should have been a celebration. Sarah stood in the doorway of their empty apartment, holding Emma's hand while the weight of their decisions settled over her like lead in her bones. Everything they owned in the world fit into 7 cardboard boxes and 3 trash bags, a testament to how little material wealth meant when survival was your daily occupation. The Honda's engine wheezed and protested as they loaded their meager possessions, the car's suspension groaning under even this modest burden. Sarah had managed to borrow a small trailer from Mrs. Patterson's neighbor, but looking at it now, hitched precariously to their dying vehicle, it seemed like a metaphor for their entire situation, hopeful but fragile, held together by determination and not much else. "You sure about this, Sarah?" Mrs. Patterson asked for the 3rd time, her weathered hands worrying the hem of her cardigan. "It's not too late to change your mind. You could stay with me for a few weeks, maybe find something closer to your jobs." But Sarah had already given notice at all 3 positions, a decision that had left her former supervisors shaking their heads in disbelief. Who walks away from steady work, even if it barely pays enough to survive? The answer was someone who had finally realized that barely surviving wasn't living at all. The drive to their new life took 4 hours instead of the usual 2, the overloaded Honda struggling up hills and shuddering with every gust of wind. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a photo of the farmhouse like a talisman, her small face pressed against the window as familiar landscapes gave way to rolling countryside that would soon become home. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the farmhouse in shades of gold and amber that made Sarah's heart lift despite her growing anxiety. But as they began unloading their belongings by the porch light, a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows over everything, the reality of what they'd done began to sink in with uncomfortable clarity. The house was colder than Sarah remembered, and smaller too, as if it had somehow shrunk in the week since their visit. The kitchen faucet that had worked during the showing now produced only a thin trickle of rust-colored water, and when Sarah flipped the light switch in the living room, nothing happened. The electricity, it seemed, had been turned off sometime between their visit and their arrival. "It's okay, Mama," Emma said with forced brightness, though her voice wavered slightly in the darkness. "We can pretend we're camping." They spent their first night huddled together on a mattress on the living room floor, wrapped in every blanket they owned while wind whistled through gaps in the windows they hadn't noticed during daylight hours. Sarah lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of rural night, owl calls and rustling leaves, and the distant lowing of cattle, while Emma's small body pressed against her side for warmth and comfort. Morning brought harsh reality and unforgiving daylight. The house that had seemed charmingly rustic now revealed itself as genuinely decrepit. Water stains bloomed across the bedroom ceiling like brown flowers, testament to the roof leaks Billy had mentioned so casually. The hardwood floors sagged in places and creaked ominously with every step. The heating system, when Sarah finally figured out how to start it, produced more smoke than warmth and filled the house with the acrid smell of something burning that probably shouldn't be. But it was the isolation that hit her hardest. Standing on the front porch with a cup of instant coffee, made with water heated over a camping stove because the kitchen stove didn't work either, Sarah looked out over their 350 acres and realized she couldn't see another house in any direction. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. The closest town, another 8 miles beyond that. They were alone in a way that city living had never prepared her for, vulnerable and exposed under the vast dome of rural sky. The money situation became critical within the first week. Sarah had spent their last $350 on the farm, counting on finding work quickly in the nearby town of Cedar Falls. But Cedar Falls, she discovered, was little more than a collection of struggling businesses held together by fading hope and stubborn pride. The grocery store was looking for part-time help, 12 hours a week at $8 an hour. The diner might have something in a few weeks, maybe. The hardware store owner took one look at her city clothes and soft tans and shook his head without even asking about her qualifications. "Times are hard around here," he explained with the weary patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "Farms are failing, young folks are moving away, and those of us left are just trying to hold on. Not much call for extra help when everyone's cutting back." Emma started school in Cedar Falls, riding a bus that picked her up at the end of their long gravel driveway at 6:45 in the morning. Sarah would walk with her through the pre-dawn darkness, flashlight beams dancing ahead of them, and then make the long walk back to the house alone. The isolation pressed in on her like physical weight during those empty daylight hours, broken only by the occasional mail delivery or the rumble of farm equipment on distant roads. The house fought them at every turn. The water pump gave out entirely during their second week, leaving them without running water until Sarah could scrape together $200 for repairs, money that came from selling her wedding ring, the last valuable thing she owned. The kitchen stove, when she finally coaxed it to life, produced flames that danced blue and orange in patterns that seemed distinctly unsafe. The refrigerator wheezed and groaned like a dying animal, keeping food barely cool enough to prevent spoilage. Sarah learned to patch roof leaks with whatever materials she could find, to wrap frozen pipes with old towels and pray they wouldn't burst, to coax heat from a furnace that seemed determined to give up entirely. Her hands grew rough and calloused from work she'd never imagined doing. She became familiar with the weight of tools, the satisfaction of fixing something herself, and the crushing disappointment of problems too big for amateur solutions. The neighbors, when she finally met them, regarded her with the polite suspicion rural communities reserved for outsiders. Tom Hendricks, who owned the farm to the north, stopped by during their third week with a casserole from his wife and a look of barely concealed skepticism.
"City folk usually don't last long out here," he said, not unkindly, but with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone stating an obvious truth. "Different kinds of life, different kind of problems." "We're not going anywhere," Sarah replied, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Tom's smile was gentle but knowing. "That's what they all say at first. Wait until your first real winter, or until something breaks that costs more than you've got, or until you realize there's no pizza delivery, no late-night convenience stores, no neighbors close enough to hear you call for help." His words haunted her during the long nights when she lay awake calculating and recalculating their dwindling resources. No income, mounting repair bills, and unexpected expenses drained their resources. The $300 in her checking account wouldn't last another week. Emma tried to be brave, tried to pretend she loved their new adventure, but Sarah could see the loneliness creeping in around the edges of her daughter's forced cheerfulness. The school bus ride was 45 minutes each way, and Emma knew no one in her new class. The other children lived on farms that had been in their families for generations, speaking a rural dialect peppered with references to crops and livestock and seasonal rhythms that might as well have been a foreign language. "The kids ask me what we grow," Emma reported one evening, picking at the dinner of beans and rice that had become their standard meal.
When I say we don't grow nothing, they look at me funny. Like, why would someone have a farm and not grow nothing on it? It was a question Sarah couldn't answer, mainly because she'd been asking herself the same thing. What exactly were they doing here? What had she thought would happen when they arrived at their $350 dream? That money would magically appear? That skills she'd never developed would suddenly manifest? That the land would somehow provide for them through sheer force of wishful thinking? Hey, I know this is getting intense, but stick with me because what happens next will blow your mind. If you're invested in Sarah and Emma's story, smash that subscribe button right now because stories like this remind us why we never give up hope, no matter how impossible things seem. The breaking point came during their 6th week when Emma developed a fever that spiked to 103 in the middle of a November night. Sarah bundled her daughter into the Honda and made the terrifying drive to the hospital in the county seat, 18 miles on winding roads she'd never traveled in darkness. The emergency room visit, even with their basic insurance, cost $450, money they absolutely didn't have. Sitting in the waiting room while Emma slept fitfully on the examination table, Sarah felt the weight of her failures pressing down like a physical presence. She'd taken her daughter away from everything familiar and stable, gambling their survival on a fantasy that was crumbling around them day by day. The farmhouse wasn't a dream, it was a money pit they couldn't afford to maintain and couldn't afford to abandon. The social worker who appeared with the morning shift change was kind but direct. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're going through some financial difficulties. We have programs that might be able to help, but I have to ask, is your current living situation stable enough for a sick child?" Sarah's throat closed around words she couldn't speak. The honest answer was no. The house was cold and damp, the water pressure barely adequate for basic hygiene, and she had less than $50 to her name. But admitting that would mean admitting failure on a scale that could cost her everything that mattered. "We're managing," she whispered, the lie tasting bitter as ashes. But driving home through morning fog that clung to the hills like doubt made visible, Emma wrapped in hospital blankets and sleeping against her shoulder, Sarah wondered how much longer she could keep pretending that managing was enough.
She carried Emma inside and tucked her into the bed they now shared, the only bedroom warm enough to be habitable, then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee and faced the brutal arithmetic of their situation. $17 in checking, no income, a daughter who needed medicine they couldn't afford, and winter closing in like a fist around their fragile hope. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows and finding every gap in the house's defenses. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called with a sound like mourning, and Sarah Chen put her head down on her folded arms and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in waves, carrying with them all the fear and frustration and bone-deep exhaustion of the past months. She cried for the job she'd left behind, for the security she traded for uncertainty, for the look in Emma's eyes when fever made her ask, "Mama, are we going to be okay?" She cried for the dreams that had seemed so possible in daylight and so foolish in the depths of rural night. But when the tears finally stopped, something else remained, something harder and more enduring than hope. Call it stubbornness or desperation or the simple refusal to let her daughter's faith in her be misplaced. Whatever it was, it straightened Sarah's spine and cleared her vision as she looked around the kitchen that was starting to feel like home despite its flaws. They'd come too far to quit now. They'd burned too many bridges to retreat. And somewhere in this place that had already demanded so much from them, there had to be something that could give back. She just had to find it. But before we dive deeper into Sarah's incredible journey, I need to ask you something. If this story is already pulling at your heartstrings, could you take just 2 seconds to hit that like button? It helps more people discover these amazing real-life stories, and trust me, you'll want to share this one with everyone you know by the end. December arrived like an unwelcome relative, settling over the farm with bitter winds and the promise of hardships yet to come.
The ancient furnace finally gave up entirely on a Tuesday morning when the temperature dropped to 8 degrees, leaving Sarah and Emma huddled around the kitchen stove for warmth while their breath fogged in the living room. The repair estimate, when Sarah could finally get a technician to make the drive out to their isolated property, was $2,800, roughly 56 times more money than she had to her name. "Lady, I hate to be the bearer of bad news," the technician said, a grizzled man named Pete who looked like he'd been fixing furnaces since the invention of fire. "But this system's older than my grandfather's teeth. Parts ain't even made anymore. You'd be better off buying a whole new unit." Sarah's laugh came out hollow and brittle. "And what would that cost? Decent system for a house this size? 6, 7,000? Maybe 8 if you want something that'll last." She thanked him and watched his truck disappear down their gravel driveway, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks in the snow and the crushing weight of impossible mathematics. That night, she and Emma slept in the kitchen, as close to the old gas stove as safety would allow, while the rest of the house settled into Arctic stillness. The water pipes froze 2 days later. Sarah discovered it when she tried to make coffee, and nothing came from the tap except a faint gurgling sound, like the house itself was choking. Pete returned with a different kind of bad news. The pipes had burst in 3 places, flooding the basement and requiring repairs that would cost another $1,500, assuming the foundation hadn't been damaged by the freeze-thaw cycle. "You've got bigger problems than plumbing," Pete observed, shining his flashlight around the basement's stone walls. "This foundation's got cracks I could put my fist through. House is settling bad. Probably been going on for years. That's why your floors sag upstairs, why your doors don't close right." Standing in ankle-deep water that had once been their basement, surrounded by the soggy remains of boxes they'd never had time to unpack, Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been cracking slowly for weeks. Something deeper and more fundamental, like the last thread holding her sanity together. "How much?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be more than they had, more than they could get, more than seemed possible in a world where $350 had once seemed like a fortune. "Foundation work?" Pete whistled low. 15? 20,000? Maybe more, depending on what we find when we really dig in. That evening, after Pete had shown her how to shut off the water main to prevent further damage, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Emma and tried to explain their situation without using words like hopeless or impossible or completely screwed. The conversation that followed would haunt her dreams for years afterward. "Mama, are we going to have to leave?" Emma asked, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate made with powdered mix and water heated on the stove. The kitchen was the only warm room in the house now, lit by a single lamp plugged into the outlet near the ancient refrigerator. "I don't know, baby. Maybe." "Where would we go?" It was the question Sarah had been avoiding all day, the one that made her stomach clench with fear so sharp it felt like physical pain. Where could they go? The apartment they'd left had been rented within days. Mrs. Patterson's couch was a possibility, but only temporarily, and Sarah's pride rebelled against the idea of crawling back to the city with her tail between her legs. They had no family, no friends with room to spare, no safety net except the fraying threads of their own determination. "We'll figure something out," Sarah said, which is what adults told children when they had absolutely no idea what they were going to do. Emma nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from life. "Could we maybe live in the barn? It might be warmer than the house." The suggestion was so innocent, so heartbreakingly practical, that Sarah nearly started crying right there at the kitchen table. Instead, she reached across and smoothed her daughter's hair, marveling at the resilience that allowed an 8-year-old to treat living in a barn as just another adventure to be navigated. "Maybe, sweetheart. Let's see what tomorrow brings." But tomorrow brought only more problems. The Honda's battery died in the bitter cold, stranding them without transportation until Tom Hendricks stopped by and offered to jumpstart it with his truck. He took one look at the frozen pipes and the steam rising from the broken furnace exhaust and shook his head with the weary resignation of someone who'd seen this story play out before. Sarah, you need to be practical here. This house is falling down around your ears. Winter's just getting started, and you've got a little girl to think about. I know what I have to think about, and I'm thinking about it just fine, thank you. Tom held up his hands in surrender. I'm not trying to tell you your business, but there's help available if you need it. County's got programs, churches have assistance funds. No shame in asking for help when you need it. But there was shame, Sarah thought, as she watched his truck disappear again. There was the shame of failure, of dragging her daughter into a situation that was clearly beyond her ability to handle. There was the shame of having believed, even for a moment, that $350 and a desperate hope could somehow transform their lives.
The breaking point came 3 days later, when Emma's teacher called to express concern about her attendance. The school bus couldn't make it down their driveway, the gravel was too rough, the distance too far from the main road, and Sarah's car was refusing to start in the bitter cold despite Tom's jump start. Emma had missed 4 days of school in 2 weeks, and the truancy officer was starting to ask questions. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're facing some challenges," the teacher said with professional sympathy. "But Emma's education has to be our priority. If she continues missing school, we'll have no choice but to involve social services." Social services. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, conjuring images of Emma being taken away, placed in foster care, lost to the system that was supposed to protect children, but often failed them in ways that left permanent scars. She'd rather die than let that happen. Rather sell everything they owned. Rather what? They own nothing worth selling except the farm itself. And who would want a property that required tens of thousands of dollars in repairs just to be habitable? They were trapped in a prison of their own making, held captive by their own desperate choices. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep on the makeshift bed they'd created near the kitchen stove, Sarah stood on the front porch in her coat and stared out at the frozen landscape that had become their world. The snow stretched away in all directions, unbroken except for fence lines and the distant lights of Tom Hendrick's farmhouse. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that seemed both beautiful and utterly indifferent to human suffering. She was so tired. Tired of being cold, tired of being scared, tired of pretending to be strong when every fiber of her being wanted to curl up and surrender. The city seemed like another lifetime, a place where problems could be solved with phone calls and credit cards and the basic infrastructure of civilization. Here, problems required resources they didn't have and skills they'd never developed. A sound from inside the house pulled her from her brooding. Emma was coughing, a harsh, rattling sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. She found her daughter sitting up on their makeshift bed, eyes bright with fever, struggling to catch her breath. "Mama, I don't feel good." Sarah's hands shook as she felt Emma's forehead. The fever was back, worse than before, and this time there was no money for the emergency room, no insurance card that would magic away the crushing weight of medical bills. Emma needed help, needed warmth and medicine and care, and Sarah was failing her in every possible way. "It's okay, baby. Just rest. We'll get you feeling better." But how? With what money? Using what resources? Sarah made Emma as comfortable as possible, then sat beside her in the dark kitchen, listening to her daughter's labored breathing and feeling the walls of their situation closing in, like the house itself was collapsing around them. Morning brought a visitor that Sarah wasn't expecting. James Patterson, Billy's uncle and Mrs. Patterson's son, driving a pickup truck that looked like it could haul the moon if necessary. He was a large man with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working with tools and machinery. "Well, Pete's right about the furnace. This thing's getter than disco, but he's wrong about the foundation." Sarah's heart jumped. Wrong how? "These aren't settling cracks. These are blast cracks." "Blast cracks?"
James ran his fingers along one of the fissures in the basement wall, following it from floor to ceiling like he was reading a story written in stone. Someone's been doing some serious excavation on this property, probably trying to put in a septic system, or maybe dig a well. Used too much dynamite, cracked your foundation all to hell. Who would do that? Previous owner, most likely. Or maybe whoever owned it before that. Point is, these cracks aren't from the house settling, they're from the ground moving, which means fixing them's not about reinforcing the foundation, it's about dealing with whatever's underneath it. Sarah felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time in weeks, though she wasn't sure why. What do you mean, underneath it? Could be anything. Cave system, underground stream, maybe somebody was digging for something and got carried away. James straightened up and brushed dust off his hands. "Tell you what, I've got some equipment that could help us figure out what we're dealing with. Ground-penetrating radar, core sampling gear. Won't cost you anything except my time, and I've got plenty of that since I retired." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. Why would you do that? James smiled, and for a moment she could see the family resemblance to Mrs. Patterson and the kindness that radiated from his weathered features. "Because my mother raised me to help folks when they need it, and because I'm curious as hell about what somebody was digging for out here." 2 days later, James arrived with a truck full of equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The ground-penetrating radar unit resembled a lawnmower crossed with a television set, complete with a screen that displayed wavy lines and colored patterns that meant nothing to Sarah but seemed to fascinate James. "This is interesting," he muttered, pushing the device slowly across their frozen backyard, while Emma watched from the kitchen window, her fever finally broken, but her color still pale. "Real interesting. What do you see?" "Cavities. Lots of them. And they're not natural." James stopped the machine and studied the screen more intently. "Sarah, I think somebody's been doing some serious mining on this property." Mining? The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the December cold. Mining for what? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? James grinned with the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered a puzzle worth solving. Could be anything. Coal, maybe, though this isn't coal country. Could be limestone, could be gravel. Hell, could be gold for all we know. Or it could be nothing worth anything. Could be, James agreed, but there's only one way to find out. The core sampling took most of the afternoon. James's equipment could drill down 30 feet, pulling up cylindrical samples of earth and rock that he laid out in careful rows like archaeological specimens. Most of the samples looked like what Sarah expected: dirt, clay, more dirt. But about halfway through the process, around the 20-foot mark, something changed. "Well, I'll be damned," James whispered, holding up a core sample that caught the winter sunlight like captured starlight. The rock was different from the others, darker, denser, shot through with veins of something that glittered with an almost crystalline brightness. Sarah had no knowledge of geology, but even she could see that this sample was unlike anything else they'd pulled from the ground. "What is it?" James turned the sample over in his hands, examining it from every angle with growing excitement. "I'm not sure, but it looks like kimberlite." "Kimberlite?" The kind of rock that forms around diamond pipes. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications that Sarah's exhausted mind couldn't quite process. Diamonds! The word belonged in fairy tales and jewelry stores, not in the frozen backyard of a failing farm in rural nowhere. "That can't be right," Sarah said finally. "Diamonds don't just exist in places like this." "Actually," James said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone trying not to raise false hopes, "they do. North America has several major diamond fields. Canada's got some of the biggest mines in the world, and Arkansas has the only public diamond mine in the United States."
But this is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's got plenty of geological surprises. The whole Appalachian region is full of mineral deposits that nobody's bothered to look for seriously. James pocketed the sample with irreverent care. I know a geologist at Penn State who owes me a favor. Mind if I have him take a look at this? Sarah's mind was reeling. 2 hours ago, she'd been contemplating surrender, trying to figure out how to tell Emma they'd have to abandon their farm and their dreams. Now James was talking about diamonds like it was the most natural thing in the world. How long would that take? A few days, maybe a week. He'll need to do proper testing, maybe bring in some specialized equipment. He paused, studying her face with concern. Sarah, I don't want to get your hopes up. Even if this is kimberlite, even if there are diamonds down there, that doesn't mean they're worth anything. Could be industrial grade, too small to matter, too deep to extract economically. But hope once kindled was difficult to extinguish. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into their makeshift bed by the kitchen stove, her daughter asked the question that had been hanging unspoken between them all evening. Mama, what's a diamond mine? Sarah smoothed Emma's hair and chose her words carefully. It's a place where people dig up really valuable stones that form deep underground over millions of years. And Mr. James thinks we might have one? Maybe, but we can't count on anything yet, sweetheart. Sometimes things that look promising don't work out. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling where shadows danced in the lamplight. If we did have diamonds, would that mean we could fix the house? If we did have diamonds, Sarah said, not allowing herself to fully believe the possibility, it would mean we could fix a lot of things. But lying awake that night, listening to the wind rattle windows and feeling the cold seep through gaps in the walls, Sarah tried not to think about diamonds or salvation or the sudden possibility that their desperate gamble might somehow pay off. She'd been disappointed too many times, had her hopes raised and dashed too often to trust in miraculous reversals of fortune. Still, when she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were full of crystalline light and the sound of Emma's laughter echoing through a house that was finally warm. The call came 5 days later, just as Sarah was beginning to think James had forgotten about them entirely. She answered on the second ring, her heart hammering with a mixture of hope and dread. Sarah, it's James. You're gonna want to sit down for this. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone, James's words echoing in her mind like something from a fever dream. You're gonna want to sit down for this. She was already sitting, perched on the edge of the kitchen chair, with Emma coloring quietly at the table beside her, but somehow her legs felt unsteady anyway. James, just tell me, is it good news or bad news? Sarah? His voice carried a mixture of excitement and disbelief that made her stomach flip. My friend, Dr. Martinez at Penn State, has been testing your samples for 3 days straight. He's brought in 2 other geologists and a mineralogist from the Smithsonian. They've run every test they can think of. The pause stretched like eternity. Emma looked up from her coloring book, sensing the tension in her mother's posture. And? Sarah, you're sitting on one of the largest undiscovered diamond deposits in North America. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She heard them, understood each individual word, but together they formed a sentence that belonged in someone else's life, not in the kitchen of a broken-down farmhouse where she'd been contemplating surrender just days before. That's not possible, she whispered. Dr. Martinez wants to come out tomorrow with a full survey team. He says the preliminary samples show diamond concentrations that are, and I quote, commercially unprecedented for this geological region. Sarah, are you still there? She was there, technically, but her mind had gone somewhere else entirely, floating somewhere above the kitchen table where reality had suddenly become negotiable. Emma was still coloring, her small hand moving the red crayon in careful circles, completely unaware that their world had just shifted on its axis. How much? The question came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. They won't give me exact numbers until they do a full survey, but Dr. Martinez said if their initial estimates are even close to accurate, we're talking about a deposit worth potentially, and I quote, $150 and $200 million. The phone slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the kitchen table.
Emma looked up with concern as her mother's face went bone white, eyes wide with shock that bordered on trauma. "Mama, are you okay?" Sarah stared at her daughter, this brave, resilient little girl who'd endured so much without complaint, who'd slept in a cold house and eaten beans and rice for dinner and asked if they could live in the barn like it was a grand adventure. $200 million. The number was so vast it lost all meaning, like trying to count stars or measure the distance to the moon. She picked up the phone with shaking hands. "James, are you sure? Are they absolutely sure?" Nobody's absolutely sure of anything until we dig, but 3 independent geologists don't get this excited about rocks unless there's something real down there. Dr. Martinez is driving down from State College tomorrow morning with a team of graduate students and enough equipment to map every inch of your property. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay next to Emma on their makeshift bed, listening to her daughter's steady breathing, while her mind raced through possibilities that seemed too enormous to grasp. $200 million. It was more money than she could conceive of, more than lottery winners received, more than movie stars earned in their entire careers. But even as the number tumbled through her thoughts, a more practical voice whispered warnings. Nothing in her life had ever been easy. Nothing had ever worked out the way it was supposed to. Why should this be different? How many people had been told they were rich only to discover that mineral rights belonged to someone else, or that extraction costs exceeded the value of the deposit, or that a dozen legal complications would tie up their fortune for decades? She thought about Emma's father, Michael, who'd walked out when Emma was 2 because the responsibility was too much. She thought about the string of jobs that promised advancement but delivered only exhaustion. She thought about the apartment they'd lost, the dreams that had crumbled, the hope that had been slowly ground down by the relentless machinery of poverty. Maybe this was just another cruel joke, another false promise designed to lift her up just high enough to make the fall hurt worse. Dr. Martinez arrived at 8 a.m., driving a convoy that looked like a scientific invasion. 3 pickup trucks loaded with equipment, 2 graduate students who couldn't have been much older than 25, and enough technological gadgetry to stock a small laboratory. The lead geologist himself was a compact man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent his career looking for exactly this kind of discovery. "Mrs. Chen, I have to tell you, in 30 years of geological surveys, I've never seen samples like the ones James brought me. We're dealing with a kimberlite pipe that appears to have been undisturbed by surface mining or natural erosion. If our initial assessment is correct, this could be one of the most significant diamond discoveries in the continental United States." Emma watched from the kitchen window as the team began setting up their equipment, her nose pressed against the glass like a child watching a carnival arrive. The men and women moved with purposeful efficiency, assembling devices that hummed and beeped and displayed colorful readouts on laptop screens. "What's all that stuff?" Emma asked. Dr. Martinez, who'd noticed her watching, smiled and gestured toward the array of equipment. "Well, that's a magnetometer, which helps us map what's underground by measuring magnetic fields. That one's a gravimeter. It detects tiny changes in gravity that might indicate different types of rock formations. And this," he patted a device that looked like a space-age metal detector, "is our electromagnetic scanner. It can tell us about mineral concentrations up to 50 feet down." "And they're all looking for diamonds?" "They're looking for the type of rock that diamonds form in," Dr. Martinez explained patiently. "Diamonds are created deep in the earth under tremendous pressure and heat, then brought to the surface by volcanic activity. The volcanic rock they travel in is called kimberlite, and that's what we found in your yard." Emma absorbed this information with the seriousness of a child processing something that might change everything she understood about the world. "Are we really rich, Mr. Doctor?" Dr. Martinez glanced at Sarah, who stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself like armor. "That's what we're here to find out, sweetheart." The survey took 4 days. 4 days of Sarah oscillating between wild hope and crushing anxiety while strangers tramped across her property with their mysterious instruments and filled notebooks with measurements that might determine her family's entire future. Emma treated it like the most exciting thing that had ever happened, following the graduate students around and asking endless questions about rocks and diamonds and how you could tell what was buried underground. On the second day, Tom Hendricks stopped by with coffee for the work crew and barely concealed curiosity about what was happening on his neighbor's property. Word had gotten out, the way it always did in small communities, and half of Cedar Falls was buzzing with speculation about what the university people were doing at the Chen place. "Heard you might have struck it rich," Tom said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become a genuine friend. "Can't say I'm not curious about what all the excitement's about." Sarah poured him coffee with hands that were steadier than they'd been in days. The constant presence of the survey team had given her something to focus on besides her own anxiety. "They think there might be diamonds under the property." "Diamonds?" Tom's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Well, I'll be damned. That would explain why the previous owner was always digging holes back there. Old Ray Patterson, Billy's grandfather, used to joke that the man was looking for buried treasure." "You knew about the digging?" "Knew about it? Hell, I helped with some of it. Must have been 15, 20 years ago. The fellow who owned this place before you bought it from the county, he was convinced there was something valuable down there. Hired some outfit from Pittsburgh to do geological surveys, brought in drilling equipment, the whole 9 yards. Sarah's heart sank. So someone else already knows about diamonds? Don't think he ever found anything worth pursuing. Spent a small fortune trying, though. Bankrupted himself chasing whatever he thought was down there, which is how the county ended up with the property in the first place. But Dr. Martinez, when Sarah asked him about it that evening, had a different perspective. Previous surveys wouldn't necessarily have found what we're finding, he explained. Technology's advanced significantly in the past 20 years. Our equipment can detect mineral concentrations and geological formations that would have been invisible to older methods.
He spread a series of printouts across the kitchen table, colorful maps and charts that looked like abstract art to Sarah's untrained eye. What we're seeing here is a kimberlite pipe that extends from about 20 feet below the surface down to at least 200 feet. That's as far as our equipment can reliably scan. The diamond concentration appears to be heaviest between 40 and 80 feet down, which explains why surface mining attempts wouldn't have been successful. Emma, who had been listening from the living room, where she was supposedly doing homework, wandered over and studied the colorful charts. So the diamonds are really deep? Deep enough that they'd require professional mining equipment to extract, Dr. Martinez confirmed, but not so deep that extraction would be economically unfeasible. On the fourth day, Dr. Martinez asked Sarah to sit down with him privately while his team finished their final measurements. They settled in the living room, which was warmer now thanks to a space heater James had loaned them, and Dr. Martinez opened a thick folder full of data and calculations. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be completely transparent with you about what we've found and what it means," he began. "Our survey has confirmed the presence of a substantial kimberlite pipe containing diamond concentrations that exceed anything we've documented in this region. Based on core samples and volumetric analysis, we estimate the deposit contains approximately 12 to 15,000 carats of recoverable diamonds." Sarah's mind went blank. She had no frame of reference for what 12,000 carats meant in practical terms. In current market conditions, and assuming a typical distribution of industrial-grade versus gem-quality stones, we estimate the total value of the deposit at between $190 and $210 million. There it was, the number that had been dancing around the edges of their conversations for 4 days, finally stated with scientific precision. $190 million. Sarah heard it, understood it intellectually, but couldn't make it connect to her reality. It was like being told she owned a piece of the moon. Of course, Dr. Martinez added quickly, extraction costs would be significant. You'd need to partner with a mining company, obtain permits, deal with environmental impact assessments. The actual profit would be substantially less than the gross value of the deposit. How much less? In a typical arrangement, the property owner might receive anywhere from 30 to 60% of the net proceeds after extraction costs, so potentially $60 to $90 million over the life of the mine.
$60 million. Even at the low end of the estimate, it was still more money than Sarah could process, more than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, more than enough to solve every problem that had ever kept her awake at night. "There's something else you need to understand," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Once word gets out about this discovery, and it will get out, you're going to have mining companies, lawyers, investors, and probably journalists showing up at your door. Some of them will try to take advantage of you. You'll need legal representation, financial advisors, people you can trust to help you navigate what comes next." That evening, after the survey team had packed up their equipment and headed back to State College, Sarah sat on the front porch with Emma and watched the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. The land looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but everything had changed in ways she was still trying to comprehend. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "does this mean we don't have to worry about money anymore?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and marveling at how such a small person had endured so much uncertainty with such grace. "I think it means we don't have to worry about money anymore. Can we fix the house?" "We can fix the house."
"Can I have my own room?" "You can have your own room. You can have 2 rooms if you want." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who'd learned not to take good fortune for granted. "Can we help Mrs. Patterson? She's been really nice to us." The question caught Sarah off guard, though it shouldn't have. Despite everything they'd been through, Emma's first thought wasn't about what she could get for herself, but about how they could help someone who'd been kind to them. It was a reminder that wealth, however it came, was ultimately meaningless if it didn't make you a better person. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We can help Mrs. Patterson. We can help a lot of people." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah Chen sat on the porch of her $350 farm and tried to wrap her mind around the fact that she was about to become one of the wealthiest women in Pennsylvania. But more important than the money, more important than anything, was the knowledge that Emma would never again have to ask if they were going to be okay. They were going to be more than okay. They were going to be extraordinary. The phone rang inside the house, and Sarah could hear it echoing through the rooms that would soon be warm and comfortable and filled with the laughter of a child who no longer had to worry about tomorrow. She didn't hurry to answer it. Whatever it was could wait a few more minutes. Right now, she just wanted to sit with her daughter and watch the stars come out over land that held treasures beyond their wildest dreams. The first mining company representatives arrived before Sarah had even finished her morning coffee, their black SUVs rolling down the gravel driveway like harbingers of a future she wasn't ready to face. Through the kitchen window, she watched 3 men in expensive suits climb out of vehicles that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past 5 years, their polished shoes completely inappropriate for the muddy February ground. "Mama, who are those people?" Emma asked, her spoon suspended halfway to her mouth, a drop of milk falling from her cereal back into the bowl. "Vultures," Sarah muttered, then immediately regretted it. Emma didn't need to hear her cynicism, didn't need to understand yet that sudden wealth attracted people whose interest was rarely aligned with your best interests. "Business people, sweetheart. People who want to help us with the diamond mine." Help had taken on new meaning in the 3 weeks since Dr. Martinez's survey team had packed up their equipment and left her with a folder of rock reports that might as well have been written in ancient Sumerian. Everyone wanted to help Sarah Chen now. Mining companies wanted to help her extract the diamonds, investment firms wanted to help her manage the money, lawyers wanted to help her navigate the legal complexities, real estate agents wanted to help her buy a mansion in the suburbs. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, when she needed help making rent, the world had been conspicuously absent. Now that she was potentially worth more than the gross domestic product of a small country, help was arriving in convoys. The lead representative introduced himself as Marcus Blackstone from Appalachian Mining Consortium, a tall man with silver hair and a smile that probably cost more than Sarah's car. His handshake was firm, his manner polished, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone accustomed to turning geological formations into profit margins. "Mrs. Chen, congratulations on your remarkable discovery," he said, settling into her kitchen chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this before. "I understand this must be an overwhelming time for you, but I want you to know that AMC has been developing mineral resources in this region for over 40 years. We have the experience, the equipment, and the environmental expertise to turn your property into a world-class mining operation." Sarah poured coffee she didn't want to drink and tried to look like someone who understood what a world-class mining operation entailed. "What exactly would that involve?"
Blackstone opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a presentation folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. "Our preliminary assessment suggests we could begin extraction within 18 months. We'd handle all permitting, environmental impact studies, infrastructure development. Our standard landowner agreement provides a 35% royalty on net proceeds, which, in your case, could amount to $60 to $70 million over the life of the mine." $60 million! Even after 3 weeks of trying to adjust to these numbers, they still hit her like a physical force. But something in Blackstone's tone, the way he emphasized standard and preliminary, made her suspicious. Dr. Martinez had mentioned that property owners could sometimes receive up to 60% of proceeds. Why was AMC's first offer so much lower? "I'll need to think about it," she said carefully. Blackstone's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. "Of course. But I should mention that AMC is prepared to offer a substantial signing bonus, $2 million, just for the exclusive right to negotiate with you. That money would be yours regardless of whether we ultimately reach an agreement." $2 million. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. 6 months ago, $2 million would have solved every problem she'd ever had, would have bought security and comfort beyond her wildest dreams. Now, it felt like pocket change compared to the true value of what lay beneath her land. But it was real money, money she could touch and spend and use to fix the furnace that still wasn't working. "I need to talk to some people," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Naturally. But Mrs. Chen, I hope you'll keep in mind that opportunities like this don't wait forever. The diamond market is volatile, environmental regulations are becoming more restrictive, and frankly, there are other properties in the region that might prove just as valuable as yours." The threat was delivered with the same polished smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Sign with this quickly, or watch your opportunity disappear. After Blackstone and his colleagues left, their business cards scattered across the kitchen table like calling cards from a world Sarah didn't understand, she found herself sitting in the same chair where she'd once contemplated surrender, staring out at the same rolling hills that had seemed like her salvation and her prison all at once. Emma appeared at her elbow with the intuitive timing of a child who sensed when her mother needed anchoring. "Are you going to sell the diamonds, Mama?" "I don't know yet, baby. It's complicated." "Do we have to sell them to be rich?" The question cut to the heart of something Sarah had been avoiding thinking about. Did they have to disturb the earth, truck away tons of rock, fundamentally alter their land in order to access the wealth that lay beneath it? Could they find a way to benefit from their discovery without destroying the place that had already given them so much? That evening, James Patterson stopped by with Chinese takeout from Cedar Falls' only restaurant, and the kind of practical advice Sarah was beginning to realize was worth more than any consultant's fees. "Marcus Blackstone called me," James said without preamble, settling across from her at the table, while Emma arranged lo mein noodles into careful patterns on her plate. "Wanted to know if I thought you'd be receptive to their offer." "What did you tell him?" "Told him you were smart enough to know the difference between their first offer and their best offer." James smiled grimly. "Sarah, I've been in this part of Pennsylvania my whole life. I've seen what happens when mining companies move into an area, and it's not always pretty. They'll make you rich, sure enough, but they'll also turn your 350 acres into something that looks like the surface of the moon."
So, you think I shouldn't do it? I think you should get a lawyer who specializes in mineral rights before you sign anything. And I think you should consider that there might be other options. Other options? Sarah was beginning to understand that wealth created possibilities she'd never imagined, but it also created complications that kept her awake at night. The phone rang constantly now. Journalists wanting interviews, distant relatives she'd never heard of suddenly remembering their family connection, investment advisors promising to turn her millions into tens of millions. She'd hired Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a lawyer from Philadelphia who specialized in mineral rights and had a reputation for protecting landowners from mining companies with more experience than scruples. Rebecca was a small woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that could dissect a contract like a surgeon removing a tumor. "AMC's offer is insulting," Rebecca said bluntly during their first meeting, spreading the mining company's proposal across Sarah's kitchen table like evidence in a criminal case. 35% of net proceeds is what they offer to desperate landowners who don't know any better. For a deposit of this magnitude, you should be looking at 50 to 60% minimum. What about the $2 million signing bonus? Pocket change, designed to make you feel like they're being generous. Sarah, based on Dr. Martinez's geological assessment, we're talking about a deposit worth potentially $200 million. $2 million is 1% of the total value. They're essentially offering you a tip to sign away your negotiating power. But Rebecca had more than just criticism to offer. She'd brought alternative proposals from 3 other mining companies, each with different approaches and revenue splits. More intriguingly, she'd also brought information about something called a limited extraction partnership, which would allow Sarah to maintain ownership of her land while partnering with a specialized firm to extract only the highest-grade diamonds through minimally invasive techniques. The environmental impact would be significantly lower, Rebecca explained, and while the total yield would be smaller, maybe 30 to 40 million instead of 60 million, you'd retain ownership of your property and could potentially pursue additional extraction in the future if market conditions improved. $30 million. Even the smaller number was more money than Sarah could reasonably expect to spend in several lifetimes. And it would allow Emma to grow up on the same land where they discovered their miracle, rather than watching it transformed into an industrial mining operation. The decision, when it finally came, arrived with the clarity that often follows weeks of agonizing uncertainty. Sarah was standing in the barn, which James had helped her convert into a temporary workshop while they planned renovations to the house, when Emma burst through the doors with the breathless excitement of a child who just discovered something wonderful. "Mama, come see, the daffodils are coming up." Sarah followed her daughter outside, where indeed the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the partially thawed ground near the front porch. Such a small thing, such an ordinary miracle of seasonal change. But in that moment, it crystallized everything Sarah had been struggling to understand about their situation. They weren't just sitting on a diamond mine. They were living on land that had already given them something invaluable: a home, a future, a chance to build the life they'd never been able to afford before. The diamonds were a gift, but they weren't the only gift. The earth that held those precious stones also held the daffodil bulbs that someone had planted years ago, trusting that spring would come again. "Rebecca," Sarah said into her cell phone an hour later, "I want to go with the limited extraction partnership. I want to keep the land." The negotiations took 6 months,
But by the time the first autumn leaves began to turn, Sarah had signed a deal with Sustainable Mineral Solutions, a Colorado-based company that specialized in low-impact diamond extraction. SMS would remove approximately 30% of the estimated deposit over a 3-year period using targeted drilling techniques that would leave the majority of the landscape undisturbed. Sarah's take would be 55% of net proceeds, potentially $35 to $40 million.
The signing took place in the law office in Harrisburg, a sterile conference room that seemed entirely disconnected from the rolling hills where this story had begun. But as Sarah signed her name on documents that would transform her family's future, she wasn't thinking about the money. She was thinking about Emma, who'd started 4th grade in a heated house with reliable plumbing and her own bedroom, who no longer had to worry about whether they could afford school supplies or winter coats. The first royalty check arrived in November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Sarah stared at the number, $847,000, until the digits began to blur. It was more money than she'd earned in the previous 10 years combined, and it was just the beginning. Emma, now 10 years old and taller by several inches, had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience that continued to amaze her mother. She still did her homework at the same kitchen table, still helped with chores around the property, still treated every day like an adventure worth exploring. But she also talked about college now, about becoming a geologist like Dr. Martinez, about traveling to see the places she read about in books. "Mama," she said one evening as they sat on the newly rebuilt front porch, watching the sun set over hills that looked exactly the same as they had 2 years ago, "do you ever miss being poor?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Miss it? Why would I miss being poor? Emma considered this carefully, the way she approached all serious subjects. "I don't know. It's just, when we were poor, it was just us against everything. Now there's all these people who want to talk to us and help us and stuff. Sometimes I miss when it was just us." Sarah pulled her daughter closer, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to come naturally to this child who'd experienced more change in her young life than most adults faced in decades. "You know what, sweetheart? It's still just us. All those other people, all that business stuff, that's just paperwork. What matters is us, right here, in this house, on this land. And we're never leaving?" "Never leaving," Sarah confirmed. "This is home." The mining operation, when it finally began the following spring, was almost anticlimactic. SMS's equipment was smaller and quieter than Sarah had expected, more like oversized construction machinery than the industrial devastation she'd feared. They worked in carefully planned sections, extracting rock samples with surgical precision, then restoring the landscape so thoroughly that within a year, grass was growing over areas where million-dollar diamonds had been pulled from the earth. Dr. Martinez stopped by regularly to monitor the operation and continued to be amazed by the quality and quantity of stones being recovered. "You know," he told Sarah during one of his visits, "this deposit is going to be studied by geologists for decades. It's changing our understanding of diamond formation in this region." But Sarah's favorite visitor was Mrs. Patterson, who'd moved into the small apartment Sarah had built above the renovated barn. At 83, the older woman claimed she was too old to maintain her city apartment, but Sarah suspected she simply enjoyed the company and the chance to help care for Emma when Sarah traveled to meetings or conferences. "Never thought I'd live to see the day when this old farm would be famous," Mrs. Patterson said one morning as they watched Emma feed the chickens Sarah had purchased on a whim. The chickens had been Emma's idea, part of a plan to make the farm more like a real farm, even though neither of them had any idea how to properly raise poultry. "Are we famous?" Sarah asked. "Haven't you seen the magazine articles, the newspaper stories? There's talk of making a documentary about the whole thing." Mrs. Patterson smiled, with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see extraordinary things happen to ordinary people. "Of course, I knew you were special from the first time Emma mentioned you. Take something special to buy a farm with $350 and no backup plan." That evening, Sarah walked the boundaries of her property as she did most nights, following paths that had become as familiar as the lines on her own hands.
The mining equipment sat silent in the distance, temporary structures that would be gone within another year. The land rolled away in all directions, still wild and beautiful, still home to the deer and rabbits and countless other creatures who lived here long before diamonds were discovered beneath the soil.
Tomorrow, there would be more meetings, more decisions about investments and trusts, and the dozens of ways that sudden wealth complicated even simple choices. But tonight, there was just the land, the sky, and the knowledge that she'd found something far more valuable than diamonds in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. She'd found home. She'd found security. Most importantly, she'd found the strength to build a future worthy of a daughter who'd never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today, even when today seemed impossible to survive. The diamonds had made them wealthy, but the land had made them whole.
After Emma left, Sarah and James settled into the comfortable routine of reviewing the various projects and investments that now comprised Sarah's life's work. The Sarah Chen Foundation had awarded over $2 million in scholarships to students pursuing careers in environmental science and sustainable technology. The foundation also funded research into low-impact mining techniques and had helped establish similar sustainable extraction operations in 3 other states. But Sarah's proudest achievement was the transformation of their property into something that served the community while preserving its essential character. The Environmental Learning Center occupied the southern 50 acres, its buildings designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape while providing cutting-edge facilities for hands-on education. Students came from as far away as Pittsburgh to participate in programs that combined traditional academic subjects with real-world environmental stewardship. The northern section of the property had become a working demonstration farm, showcasing sustainable agriculture techniques and providing fresh produce to food banks throughout the region. Mrs. Patterson, now 88 and still sharp as a tack, managed the volunteer program that helped maintain the gardens and taught urban kids about where food actually came from. "Speaking of the foundation," James said, opening another folder, "we got 3 new applications for the Emergency Assistance Fund this week." The Emergency Assistance Fund was Sarah's way of paying forward the kindness that had saved them during their darkest days. It provided immediate financial help to families facing eviction, medical emergencies, or other crises that could derail lives already hanging by threads. Sarah reviewed each application personally, remembering what it felt like to need help and have nowhere to turn. "Tell me about them," she said, settling into what had become their weekly ritual of connecting resources with need. "First one's a single father in Altoona, lost his job at the steel plant, 3 kids, facing eviction next month. Second is a family in York whose house burned down. Insurance is fighting the claim. Third one's close to home, young mother in Cedar Falls, car broke down and she can't afford repairs. Without transportation, she'll lose her job at the nursing home." "Approve all 3, Sarah said without hesitation. "And let's see if we can connect the father in Altoona with the job training program at Penn State. The family in York, make sure they know about the temporary housing assistance we partner with. And the mother in Cedar Falls, let's not just fix her car, let's see if she'd be interested in the nursing program scholarship we're offering through the community college." This was how wealth should work, Sarah had learned. Not as an end in itself, but as a tool for creating opportunities that rippled outward through communities and generations. Every dollar they spent on education, emergency assistance, and sustainable development was an investment in a future where fewer families would face the desperate choices that had once defined their lives. The National Geographic reporter arrived precisely at 2, an earnest young woman named Jessica Martinez who bore no relation to Dr. Martinez but shared his passion for geological discoveries. She set up recording equipment in the living room while Mrs. Patterson fussed over the apple pie, and Emma returned from school with timing that suggested she was more interested in the interview than she'd admitted. "Mrs. Chen," Jessica began once they were all settled, "5 years after your discovery, how has your life changed?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The obvious answer was completely. They lived in a warm house, drove reliable cars, never worried about money, traveled when they wanted to, and had security that extended far beyond their own needs. But the deeper truth was more complex. In some ways, everything's changed.
We have financial security we never dreamed of. Emma has opportunities I could never have provided before. We can help other people in ways that make a real difference. And in other ways? In other ways, we're exactly the same people we always were. We still live on the same land, still value the same things. Emma still does her homework at that kitchen table, still helps with chores, still treats every day like an adventure worth exploring. I still wake up grateful for what we have and determined to use it well.
Emma, perched on the arm of the couch, added her perspective.
I think the biggest change is that I don't worry anymore. I used to worry about everything. Whether we'd have enough money for groceries, whether Mom was okay, whether we'd have to move again. Now I get to worry about normal teenage stuff, like whether I'll get into MIT and what I want to study.
MIT? Jessica's eyebrows rose. Early admission, Emma said while studying nonchalance. I want to study geological engineering and sustainable resource extraction. Figure if I'm going to inherit a family business, I should understand it. The interview continued for another hour, covering the technical aspects of the discovery, the environmental considerations of the mining operation, and the Foundation's work. But Jessica's most perceptive question came near the end, when she asked Sarah what she'd learned about wealth and poverty during their transformation. I learned that poverty isn't a moral failing. It's usually a lack of opportunities, or bad luck, or circumstances beyond your control. I worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. That wasn't because I wasn't trying hard enough. It was because the system is designed in a way that makes it almost impossible to climb out of certain holes. She paused, thinking about the families they'd helped through the Foundation, the stories that echoed their own journey in countless variations. I also learned that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. Having money means having the power to change things, and if you're not using that power to make the world a little better, you're wasting it. Emma and I didn't earn this discovery through any virtue on our part. We got incredibly lucky. The question is what we do with that luck. And what are you doing with it? We're trying to create more luck for other people. More opportunities, more second chances, more reasons to hope that tomorrow can be better than today. After Jessica left, carrying memory cards full of interviews and hundreds of photographs of the property, Sarah walked her favorite evening route around the boundaries of their land. The path took her past the Environmental Learning Center, where security lights illuminated laboratories where tomorrow's scientists were learning to balance human needs with environmental protection. She paused at the memorial they'd installed the previous year, a simple stone bench dedicated to all the families who face impossible choices with courage and dignity. It was her way of honoring not just their own journey, but the millions of other families struggling to build better lives against overwhelming odds. Emma found her there as the stars began to appear, settling onto the bench with the easy familiarity of someone who'd shared countless conversations in this spot. "Good interview?" Sarah asked. She asked me if I ever regret that our story became so public. I told her no, because maybe hearing about us will help some other family realize they shouldn't give up, even when things look impossible. You're wise beyond your years, you know that. Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, still small enough to fit in the space between Sarah's arm and heart. I had a good teacher. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the learning center and listening to the nighttime sounds of a countryside that had given them everything they'd never dared to dream. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called with a sound that no longer seemed like mourning, but like a song of completion. "Mom," Emma said, her voice soft in the darkness, "do you think Dad ever wonders what happened to us?" It was a question Emma asked occasionally, usually during moments of quiet reflection like this one. Sarah had long ago stopped feeling angry at Michael for leaving. Their discovery had taught her that holding on to old hurts was like trying to mine diamonds with spite instead of proper equipment. It only damaged what you were trying to create.
I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. But you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. We built something beautiful without him, and that's not diminished by his absence. I know. I just sometimes wonder if he knows we're okay. We're more than okay, Sarah said, pulling her daughter closer. We're exactly where we're supposed to be.
The next morning brought news that would add one more chapter to their ongoing story. Dr. Martinez called with barely contained excitement to report that preliminary surveys on 3 other properties in the region had found similar geological formations. If his hypothesis was correct, their discovery wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a much larger diamond field that could transform the entire region's economy. Sarah, this could be the beginning of the most significant diamond mining development in North American history, he said. And because of how you handled your extraction, the environmental protocols, the community partnerships, the sustainable practices, you've basically created the template for how it should be done. The implications were staggering. Sarah's phone began ringing with calls from property owners, mining companies, environmental groups, and government officials, all wanting guidance on how to balance economic opportunity with environmental responsibility. The farm that had once isolated them from the world was becoming the center of a new model for ethical resource development. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the latest reports and fielded calls from reporters, researchers, and policymakers, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway with the patient expression of someone who'd been waiting for attention. "Mom, can we talk?" Sarah set aside her phone and gave Emma her full attention, a habit she'd developed during their poorest days and had no intention of abandoning now that they were wealthy. "What's on your mind?" "All this stuff that's happening, the other properties, the mining development, the attention from Washington, it's big, isn't it?" "Very big." Emma settled into the chair across from her, the same chair she'd occupied as an 8-year-old when they'd first arrived at the farm with everything they owned packed into 7 cardboard boxes. "Are you scared?" The question surprised Sarah, though it shouldn't have. Emma had always been perceptive about her mother's emotional state, had learned to read the subtle signs of worry or stress that Sarah tried to hide. "A little," Sarah admitted. "When you become the example that everyone points to, there's pressure to get everything right. People are going to be watching how we handle this next phase, and our decisions could affect hundreds of families, thousands of acres of land, millions of dollars in economic development." "But we've gotten everything right so far." "We've tried to, but the stakes keep getting bigger, and I sometimes worry about whether I'm qualified to be making decisions that affect so many people." Emma was quiet for a moment, considering this with the seriousness she brought to all important conversations. "You know what I think?" "What do you think?" "I think you're exactly the right person to be making these decisions because you remember what it's like to have nothing. All those other people, the mining companies, the politicians, the investors, they've never sat in a cold house wondering if they could afford groceries. They've never had to choose between fixing their car and paying rent." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand, a gesture that reminded her of countless similar moments when their roles had been reversed, when she'd been the one offering comfort and reassurance. "You're not going to forget where we came from, and you're not going to let other people forget either. That's why all this is happening to us instead of someone else. The universe knew we'd use it right." Looking at her daughter, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited not just financial security, but a profound understanding of responsibility and compassion, Sarah felt the last of her doubts settle into something like peace. They'd found diamonds in their backyard, but the real treasure had been discovered in moments like this, when love and wisdom and hope converged into something stronger than any mineral formation. "When did you get so smart?" Sarah asked. "I learned from the best," Emma replied, echoing Mrs. Patterson's words from years ago, but making them her own. Outside, night settled over the hills that held their history and their future in equal measure. The Environmental Learning Center stood ready for tomorrow's students, the foundation prepared to help families facing impossible choices. And somewhere beneath the rolling farmland, Diamond deposits waited to fund dreams that hadn't even been imagined yet. Sarah Chen had bought a farm for $350 and discovered treasure worth millions. But sitting in her warm kitchen with her brilliant daughter and their shared commitment to using their good fortune wisely, she understood that the real miracle had never been the diamonds. The real miracle had been the courage to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, even when today seemed impossible to survive. Everything else, the wealth, the recognition, the opportunity to help others, was just the interest earned on an investment in hope made by a desperate mother who refused to let her daughter's faith in her be misplaced. The diamonds had made them wealthy, but hope had made them rich beyond measure. If Sarah's incredible journey from a $350 farm to multi-millionaire inspired you, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing true stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear that miracles can happen when you refuse to give up. What would you do if you discovered diamonds in your backyard? Let me know in the comments below. The most challenging question comes from 70-year-old Margaret Sullivan, whose family had farmed the same land for 4 generations, asking how the community can trust that Sarah won't end up controlling everything despite good intentions, given that money creates power and power can corrupt. Sarah's honest response acknowledges the validity of the concern while outlining specific safeguards, structuring her family's contribution as a loan rather than investment, establishing an elected board for major decisions, creating independent oversight, and allowing cooperative members to vote to buy out the loan if they feel Sarah's involvement becomes harmful. 23 property owners signed preliminary agreements, enough to move forward despite some families having already committed to consolidated mining. The following months involve intensive work, drafting legal documents, conducting environmental assessments, negotiating financing, and purchasing equipment. The cooperative hires experienced professionals, including a mine supervisor with sustainable extraction experience, an environmental engineer, and a community liaison who understands local cultural dynamics. Emma defers her PhD program to work full-time on the cooperative launch, bringing academic rigor to practical problems and serving as a bridge between high-tech mining aspects and human-scale community concerns. The first extraction begins on a cold November morning with equipment designed to appear surgical rather than industrial, housed in facilities resembling large barns rather than industrial plants. When David Hendricks witnesses the first core samples from his property confirming high-grade diamond concentrations, he represents the transformation the cooperative enables, moving from generations of survival farming to family security. His plans reflect the community-minded thinking Sarah hoped to foster: college funds for his children, expansion of the community health clinic, and scholarship programs for local students studying agriculture or environmental science. Success brings unexpected challenges as regional media attention attracts national interest. Sarah finds herself fielding interview requests from major networks and publications, while the cooperative becomes a business school case study and attracts political attention from both parties. The media coverage, while flattering, sometimes distorts their nuanced story into simplified narratives that miss the complexity of their actual accomplishments. Sarah struggles with unwanted public attention, having never sought the spotlight that now seems to follow her everywhere. The decision to expand beyond Pennsylvania emerges through a phone call from Rosa Martinez in Colorado, whose community faces coal mine closures and economic devastation. With unemployment approaching 40% and rare earth mineral deposits offering potential, Rosa seeks help developing alternatives to strip mining companies that would extract everything and abandon the area. This call forces Sarah and Emma to confront whether keeping their model localized is selfish when it could help communities nationwide facing similar economic challenges.
Their decision to help Rosa leads to the establishment of the Sarah Chen Cooperative Development Institute, which helps create sustainable resource extraction cooperatives in 12 communities across the American West. Each project differs in specific resources: rare earth minerals in Colorado, lithium in Nevada, and timber in Oregon, but maintains the same fundamental principles: community ownership, environmental responsibility, and long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. Emma completes her PhD with a dissertation on cooperative resource development models and establishes a consulting firm specializing in helping rural communities navigate sustainable development challenges. Emma's constant travel creates new emotional challenges as Sarah misses their simple conversations and worries about losing the intimate family connections that made their journey meaningful. A conversation with James Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son and Sarah's longtime advisor, helps Sarah recognize that her nostalgia for simpler times shouldn't prevent appreciation for their extraordinary legacy. He points out that Emma is having an extraordinary adulthood, using her gifts to help people build better lives, and that their work represents a legacy that will impact thousands of families for generations. The resolution comes when Emma proposes restructuring the institute to bring community representatives to Pennsylvania for intensive workshops rather than constantly traveling to different locations. This elegant solution allows Emma to spend more time at home while potentially providing better training for communities they serve. The first workshop brings 30 representatives from 9 states, including coal miners from Appalachia, ranchers from Montana, and tribal leaders from Alaska, who share ideas and experiences while staying in renovated dormitories and learning in the Environmental Learning Center. Watching these diverse groups connect and learn together while overlooking the hills that gave the Chen family their second chance, Sarah experiences complete contentment with their choices. The narrative explores multiple interconnected themes: the tension between immediate financial relief and long-term sustainable prosperity, the challenge of scaling successful small models to regional impact, the responsibility that comes with wealth and knowledge, and the delicate balance between helping others and maintaining family connections. Most significantly, the story demonstrates how true wealth transcends monetary value. While diamonds remain deep beneath the rolling hills, they are no longer the property's most valuable resource. That honor belongs to the knowledge that tomorrow can always be better than today, when people believe in each other and work towards something larger than themselves. Under stars that have remained constant throughout their journey from poverty to prosperity to purpose, Sarah and Emma recognize that their land has become a foundation for building the kind of future Mrs. Patterson always believed possible, where hard work, kindness, and stubborn hope transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, creating lasting positive change across multiple generations and geographic regions.